Photographic restoration expert Caroline Stevens had been commissioned to digitize a collection of frontier wedding photographs for the Wyoming State Museum when she encountered an image that would haunt her for weeks. The museum had acquired the collection from the estate of a prominent Cheyenne family, and most of the photographs showed the typical joy and celebration associated with frontier weddings of the 1870s. "This particular photograph has always troubled our family," explained museum donor Margaret Wilson as she handed Stevens a carefully preserved cabinet card. "It shows my great-great-grandmother, Sarah Mackenzie, on her wedding day in 1876. The family story says she was very happy about her marriage, but there's something about her expression that never seemed quite right." Stevens had specialized in frontier photography for over a decade and was familiar with the conventions of Western wedding portraiture from that era. Frontier brides typically posed with expressions of dignified happiness that reflected both personal joy and social accomplishment in securing advantageous marriages in sparsely populated territories. The Wyoming State Museum occupied a stately building in downtown Cheyenne, and Stevens had set up her digital restoration equipment in a quiet corner of the archives. She had been working methodically through the wedding photograph collection, scanning each image at high resolution to preserve details that might be lost to time and environmental damage. The Mackenzie wedding portrait had been taken at Thompson Studio in Cheyenne, one of the territory's premier photography establishments that specialized in documenting important social events for Wyoming's growing population of ranchers, merchants, and territorial officials. The photograph showed Sarah Mackenzie in an elaborate white wedding dress that indicated considerable expense and social ambition. Her pose was conventional for frontier wedding photography, standing beside her seated husband, one hand resting on his shoulder, the other holding a small bouquet of wildflowers that had been carefully arranged for the portrait session. At first glance, Sarah appeared to be the picture of bridal happiness. Her mouth was curved in what seemed to be a genuine smile, her posture was graceful and confident, and her dress and jewelry suggested that she was marrying into prosperity and social status. But when Stevens used professional magnification equipment to examine Sarah's face in detail, she discovered something deeply disturbing that had been invisible to casual observers for nearly 150 years. The 1876 wedding portrait showed Sarah Mackenzie in the elaborate finery that characterized frontier wedding photography of that era. Her dress was an expensive creation of white silk and lace that had likely been ordered from Denver or even imported from the East, indicating that no expense had been spared for this important social occasion. Sarah's wedding dress featured the intricate beadwork and detailed embroidery that were popular among wealthy frontier families who wanted to demonstrate their prosperity and refinement, despite the rustic conditions of territorial life. Her veil was secured with what appeared to be genuine pearls, and her jewelry included an elaborate necklace and matching earrings that suggested significant financial resources. The bride's pose followed the established conventions of frontier wedding photography. She stood gracefully beside her seated husband, Thomas Barrett, a prominent Cheyenne businessman who owned several commercial properties and had investments in cattle ranching operations throughout southeastern Wyoming. Barrett appeared to be a man in his early 40s, significantly older than his 19-year-old bride, which was typical of frontier marriages where older, established men often married much younger women from families seeking financial security and social advancement. The studio backdrop featured painted elements that suggested prosperity and civilization, classical columns and garden scenery that created an atmosphere of refinement despite the frontier setting. The photographer had arranged professional lighting to create even illumination across both subjects, demonstrating the technical expertise that wealthy clients expected from Cheyenne's premier photography establishment. Sarah's facial expression appeared to show genuine happiness and satisfaction with her marriage. Her smile seemed natural and unforced, her posture was confident and relaxed, and her overall demeanor suggested a young woman who was pleased with her circumstances and optimistic about her future. Her bouquet consisted of wildflowers that had been carefully arranged to create an elegant presentation, prairie roses, lupines, and other native Wyoming flowers that had been gathered specifically for the portrait session. The bouquet's composition suggested considerable attention to detail and aesthetic presentation. However, when Stevens examined Sarah's face under high magnification, she began to notice subtle details that contradicted the impression of bridal. joy that the portrait was intended to convey. Stevens focused her professional analysis equipment on Sarah Mackenzie's face, studying the details that had made the photograph troubling to her descendants. What she discovered was a profound disconnect between Sarah's smiling expression and the terror that was clearly visible in her eyes. While Sarah's mouth displayed what appeared to be genuine happiness, her eyes told a completely different story. Under magnification, her gaze showed unmistakable signs of fear and desperation that were completely inconsistent with a joyful bride on her wedding day. Sarah's eyes were wide with what Stevens recognized as barely controlled panic. Her pupils were dilated in a way that suggested extreme stress or fear, and the muscles around her eyes showed the tension associated with someone trying to maintain composure while experiencing internal terror. Most disturbing was the quality of Sarah's gaze, which appeared to be directed not at the photographer's camera but towards someone or something outside the frame of the photograph. Her eyes showed the kind of desperate attention that indicated she was seeking help or escape from a threatening situation. The contrast between Sarah's forced smile and her terrified eyes created a deeply unsettling effect. It was clear that she was making a tremendous effort to appear happy for the photograph while simultaneously experiencing genuine fear about her circumstances. Stevens also noticed that Sarah's hands, while positioned gracefully for the portrait, showed signs of trembling that were visible in the slight blurring of her fingers and bouquet. The photographer's relatively long exposure time had captured this involuntary movement, providing additional evidence of her emotional distress. Most troubling was the realization that Sarah's fear appeared to be directed towards someone who was present during the photography session but was not visible in the portrait itself. Her gaze suggested that she was trying to communicate her distress to someone who might be able to help her, while simultaneously trying to maintain the facade of bridal happiness that was expected for such an important social occasion. The photograph had accidentally captured evidence of a bride who was experiencing genuine terror on what should have been one of the happiest days of her life. Stevens knew that understanding the context behind Sarah Mackenzie's frightened expression would require extensive research into frontier marriage customs and the specific circumstances surrounding her wedding to Thomas Barrett. She began by examining territorial records and newspaper archives from Cheyenne in 1876 to learn more about the families involved and the social context of their marriage. Wyoming territorial records at the state archives showed that the Mackenzie family had arrived in Cheyenne in 1875, part of the wave of settlers who had been attracted to southeastern Wyoming by opportunities in cattle ranching and commerce related to the Transcontinental Railroad. James Mackenzie, Sarah's father, had been a struggling farmer who had brought his family west after failing to establish successful agricultural operations in Nebraska. The family had arrived in Wyoming with limited financial resources and had been dependent on finding employment or business opportunities that could provide basic survival in the harsh frontier environment. Thomas Barrett, Sarah's bridegroom, was documented as one of Cheyenne's most successful businessmen during the mid-1870s. He owned several commercial buildings in the downtown area, had investments in multiple cattle ranching operations, and had been involved in territorial politics as a supporter of Wyoming's eventual statehood efforts. Barrett had been married once before, but his first wife had died in 1874 under circumstances that were not clearly documented in territorial records. He had been left with 2 young children from his first marriage and had apparently been seeking a new wife who could manage his household and help care for his existing family. The marriage between Sarah Mackenzie and Thomas Barrett had been announced in the Cheyenne Daily Leader in May 1876, described as a union that will benefit both families and strengthen the commercial ties that are essential for territorial development. However, Stevens also discovered that the marriage had been arranged very quickly, with less than 2 weeks between the public announcement and the wedding ceremony. This rapid timeline was unusual even for frontier marriages, suggesting that there might have been urgent circumstances that had motivated the arrangement. Further research into the Mackenzie family's circumstances revealed that Sarah's marriage to Thomas Barrett had been the result of financial desperation rather than romantic attraction. Territorial court records showed that James Mackenzie had accumulated significant debts during his first year in Wyoming and had been facing legal action from creditors who were threatening to seize the family's few remaining possessions. Barrett had apparently offered to resolve Mackenzie's financial difficulties in exchange for marriage to his 19-year-old daughter. The arrangement had included payment of Mackenzie's debts, provision of employment for Sarah's brothers, and a modest financial settlement that would allow the Mackenzie family to establish themselves more securely in the territorial economy. This type of marriage arrangement was not uncommon on the frontier, where economic survival often took precedence over romantic considerations. However, the speed with which the arrangement had been finalized suggested that Mackenzie had been under extreme pressure to accept Barrett's proposal. Stevens discovered correspondence between Barrett and Mackenzie that had been preserved in the territorial court files related to debt resolution. The letters revealed that Barrett had been very specific about his expectations for the marriage, and had made it clear that he viewed Sarah as a business acquisition rather than a romantic partner. Barrett's letters described his need for a young wife who can bear additional children and manage household operations efficiently, making no mention of affection or emotional considerations. He had also specified that Sarah would be expected to serve as a mother to his existing children and would have no independent authority over household decisions. Most disturbing was Barrett's correspondence with other business associates, which had been included in the court files as evidence of his financial capacity to resolve Mackenzie's debts. These letters revealed that Barrett had a reputation for controlling and dominating the people around him, including business partners and employees. Several associates had described Barrett as someone who expected absolute obedience from anyone who was dependent on his financial support. One letter from a former business partner characterized Barrett as a man who views all relationships in terms of power and control, with little regard for the comfort or happiness of others. The evidence suggested that Sarah had been forced into marriage with a man who was known for his harsh treatment of people who were financially dependent on him. Stevens' investigation into Thomas Barrett's background revealed a pattern of behavior. That explained why Sarah Mackenzie had appeared terrified on her wedding day. Territorial records and newspaper accounts from the mid-1870s documented several incidents that suggested Barrett was a violent and controlling man who had a history of abusing those who were unable to resist his authority. Court records from 1875 showed that Barrett had been involved in a legal dispute with a former employee who had accused him of assault and battery. The employee, a ranch hand named Miguel Santos, had alleged that Barrett had beaten him severely for questioning the safety of cattle handling procedures that had resulted in injuries to several workers. Although the case had been dismissed due to lack of sufficient witnesses, most of Barrett's employees had been unwilling to testify against their employer. The court records included detailed testimony from Santos that described Barrett's explosive temper and his tendency to use physical violence to resolve disagreements. The testimony had also revealed that Barrett's first wife, Margaret, had been seen with unexplained injuries during the months before her death in 1874. Several Cheyenne residents had noticed bruises on her face and arms that she had attributed to household accidents, but the pattern and frequency of these injuries had raised suspicions among women in the community. Dr. Henry Walsh, who had treated Margaret Barrett during her final illness, had provided confidential testimony to territorial authorities, suggesting that her death might not have been entirely due to natural causes. While the doctor had been careful not to make direct accusations, his medical observations had indicated that Margaret had been in a state of severe physical and emotional distress that was consistent with ongoing abuse. The doctor's testimony had been suppressed due to Barrett's political influence and his threats of legal action against anyone who questioned his character. However, the sealed court records preserved Dr. Walsh's concerns about the circumstances surrounding Margaret Barrett's death. Stevens also discovered that several women in Cheyenne's small social community had attempted to warn the Mackenzie family about Barrett's reputation before the marriage arrangement was finalized. These women had been aware of the suspicions surrounding his first wife's death and had observed his controlling behavior toward business associates and employees. However, James Mackenzie's desperate financial situation had made him unwilling to consider these warnings, and Sarah had been given no choice in the matter once her father had committed to the marriage arrangement. Stevens found additional documentation about Sarah Mackenzie's wedding day that provided context for the terror visible in her portrait. Church records from St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Cheyenne included detailed notes from Reverend William Thompson, who had performed the marriage ceremony and had observed disturbing interactions between the bride and groom. Reverend Thompson's private journal, preserved in the church archives, described Sarah as appearing profoundly distressed during the wedding preparations. The minister had noted that she had been reluctant to speak during the rehearsal and had seemed to be constantly looking toward the church exits as if seeking opportunities to escape. The journal also recorded the minister's observations about Thomas Barrett's behavior toward his bride during the wedding preparations. Barrett had been unusually controlling and possessive, insisting on making all decisions about the ceremony and showing what the minister characterized as an inappropriate level of physical contact that seemed designed to establish dominance rather than express affection. Most significantly, Reverend Thompson had documented an incident that had occurred just before the photography session at Thompson's studio. According to his journal, Barrett had been observed threatening Sarah in the church vestibule, warning her that any display of reluctance or unhappiness during the wedding photographs would result in severe consequences for her and her family. The minister had overheard Barrett tell Sarah that her family's financial security depended on her ability to convincingly portray herself as a happy bride, and that any failure to maintain this performance would result in the cancellation of his support for the Mackenzie family. This threat explained why Sarah had been making such a desperate effort to appear joyful in the wedding portrait, while simultaneously experiencing obvious terror. She had understood that her family's survival depended on her ability to convince others that she was happy with her marriage, even though she was genuinely afraid of her new husband. The journal also revealed that several wedding guests had noticed Sarah's distress, but had chosen not to intervene due to Barrett's reputation for retaliation against anyone who challenged his authority. The social and economic realities of frontier life had made it dangerous for community members to interfere in marriages, even when they suspected that abuse was occurring. Stevens discovered that the fears visible in Sarah's wedding portrait had been tragically prophetic. Records from the years following her marriage revealed that Thomas Barrett had indeed proven to be an abusive and controlling husband, who had made Sarah's life a nightmare of fear and violence. Medical records from Dr. Henry Walsh showed that Sarah had become a frequent patient during her first year of marriage, seeking treatment for injuries that she consistently attributed to household accidents. The pattern and severity of these injuries had convinced Dr. Walsh that Sarah was being systematically abused by her husband. The doctor's confidential notes described bruises, cuts, and other injuries that were consistent with domestic violence rather than accidental harm. Dr. Walsh had also documented Sarah's obvious fear and her reluctance to discuss the circumstances of her injuries, which he recognized as typical behavior of abuse victims who were afraid of retaliation. Most disturbing were the doctor's observations about Sarah's psychological condition during the early years of her marriage. His notes described symptoms that would now be recognized as severe depression and post-traumatic stress, including persistent anxiety, sleep disorders, and what he characterized as a profound sense of hopelessness and despair. Dr. Walsh had attempted to provide what help he could within the constraints of 1870s medical practice and social attitudes, but he had been limited by the lack of legal protections for married women and the general acceptance of husbands' authority over their wives. Church records from St. Mark's Episcopal Church showed that Sarah had sought counsel from Reverend Thompson on multiple occasions during her first years of marriage. The minister's notes described her desperate pleas for guidance about how to cope with her husband's violence while protecting her family from the financial consequences of challenging Barrett's authority. Reverend Thompson had been deeply troubled by Sarah's situation, but had been constrained by both religious doctrine and social conventions that emphasized wives' duties to submit to their husband's authority. His private journals revealed his internal struggle between his desire to help Sarah and his belief that interfering in marriages was inappropriate for clergy. The evidence showed that Sarah's terrified expression in her wedding portrait had accurately predicted the suffering that she would experience throughout her marriage to Thomas Barrett. Stevens's investigation revealed that Sarah Mackenzie Barrett's story had ended in tragedy that confirmed the worst fears visible in her wedding portrait. Territorial records from 1879 documented her death under circumstances that strongly suggested domestic violence, though the official cause of death had been listed as accidental injury. Sarah had died from what Dr. Walsh described in his medical report as severe head trauma resulting from a fall down the stairs of the Barrett residence. However, the doctor's private notes, preserved in his personal papers, indicated that the injuries were more consistent with violent assault than accidental falling. Dr. Walsh had documented multiple skull fractures and other injuries that suggested Sarah had been beaten severely before the incident that caused her death. The doctor had also noted that the pattern of injuries was inconsistent with a simple fall and had privately concluded that Sarah had been murdered by her husband. However, Barrett's political influence and economic power had prevented any serious investigation of Sarah's death. Territorial authorities had accepted the official explanation of accidental death, despite the medical evidence that suggested otherwise, and no charges had been filed against Barrett. The coroner's inquest had been perfunctory, with testimony limited to Barrett's own account of finding Sarah at the bottom of the stairs after allegedly hearing a loud noise from upstairs. No independent witnesses had been called, and the medical evidence had been minimized to support the predetermined conclusion of accidental death. Church records showed that Reverend Thompson had been deeply troubled by the circumstances of Sarah's death and had suspected that she had been murdered. However, the minister had been unable to challenge the official findings due to Barrett's threats of legal action and his influence with territorial officials. Most tragically, Stevens discovered that Sarah had left behind a letter that had been hidden in the church and had been found only after Reverend Thompson's own death several years later. The letter, written shortly before her death, had described the ongoing abuse she had suffered and had expressed her fear that Barrett would eventually kill her. The letter had also revealed that Sarah had been planning to seek help from federal authorities, believing that territorial officials were too influenced by Barrett's wealth and political connections to provide protection. However, she had been murdered before she could carry out this plan. Stevens's investigation concluded with the recognition that Sarah Mackenzie's 1876 wedding portrait had captured the face of a young woman who had accurately predicted her own tragic fate. The terror visible in her eyes had reflected her understanding that her marriage would be a death sentence, even though she had been powerless to escape the economic forces that had trapped her in the arrangement. The photograph served as evidence of how frontier economic conditions and social attitudes had made women extremely vulnerable to domestic violence and abuse. Sarah's forced marriage to Barrett had been the direct result of her family's financial desperation and the lack of alternative options for women in territorial society. The case also demonstrated how wealth and political influence could prevent justice for victims of domestic violence, even when the evidence of abuse was clear to medical professionals and community members. Barrett's ability to control the investigation of Sarah's death had ensured that he faced no consequences for what appeared to be murder. Most significantly, the investigation had revealed how historical photographs could preserve evidence of social conditions and individual tragedies that might otherwise be forgotten or minimized by official records. Sarah's wedding portrait had documented a moment of genuine terror that had been invisible to most observers at the time, but had been captured permanently by the photographer's camera. The photograph also illustrated the importance of recognizing signs of distress and abuse that might be hidden behind facades of happiness or social compliance. Sarah's forced smile had concealed her terror for nearly 150 years, but modern analysis techniques had finally revealed the truth about her emotional state on her wedding day. Stevens realized that the portrait was valuable not just as a historical artifact, but as evidence of the violence and oppression that had characterized many women's lives during the frontier period. Sarah's terrified eyes served as a reminder that the romanticized image of frontier life often concealed harsh realities of abuse and exploitation. As Stevens prepared her final report for the Wyoming State Museum, she reflected on how advanced photographic analysis had revealed a story of forced marriage, domestic violence, and murder that had been successfully concealed for over a century. The wedding portrait would remain in the museum's collection as testimony to Sarah Mackenzie's suffering and as a warning about the importance of protecting vulnerable people from those who would abuse power and authority. The photograph served as Sarah's final testimony about the terror she had experienced, preserved accidentally in an image that was supposed to celebrate the happiest day of her life, but had actually documented the beginning of a nightmare that had ended in her death.